Hello everyone, and welcome back to MrBall Thornwick Stories. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you doze off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. In this new story. Across Appalachia, rural doctors still answer calls from families living far beyond the nearest hospital. Mountain roads can disappear beneath fog, addresses may belong to homes without numbers, and storms often interrupt every form of communication except an old telephone line. But in December 2021, a physician in eastern Tennessee received an emergency request from a hollow abandoned more than 70 years earlier. A woman was dying during childbirth, and the midwife insisted that only he could save the baby. When the doctor reached the house, he discovered that the child had his mother's name and was scheduled to be born in 1948. Dr. Caleb Monroe operated a small medical clinic outside the town of Ash Ridge. He had spent most of his childhood in the surrounding mountains and knew nearly every family between the Tennessee border and the Cumberland Plateau. His 73-year-old mother, Eleanor, lived nearby in the same farmhouse where she had raised him. She rarely discussed her early childhood, explaining only that she had been adopted after her birth parents died in an accident somewhere near an isolated community called Mercy Hollow. Shortly after 11 on a freezing Thursday night, the clinic's disconnected landline began ringing. Caleb had kept the old telephone only because it had belonged to the previous doctor, but the service company had removed the outside wire years earlier. When he answered, a woman identified herself as Ruth Bell, a midwife in Mercy Hollow. She reported that a patient named Margaret Monroe had been in labor for nearly 12 hours and was losing blood. The road was blocked, the local doctor had not arrived, and the unborn child's heartbeat was becoming weak. Caleb had never heard of Margaret Monroe. The caller gave an address on Bell Creek Road beyond an area where the modern highway ended at a Forest Service gate. Before the connection failed, Ruth added that the child had to survive because her name was Eleanor Monroe. Caleb asked for the date. The midwife calmly answered the 9th of December 1948, then warned him to bring the black medical bag stored beneath his clinic floor. Sheriff Laura Pike arrived after Caleb reported the call. Together, they removed several floorboards from the clinic's oldest examination room and discovered a leather medical case sealed beneath the wood. Its brass plate belonged to Dr. Samuel Reed, the physician who had operated the clinic between 1939 and 1952. Inside were surgical instruments, glass medication bottles, and a birth certificate already completed for Eleanor Monroe. The infant's birth date was the 10th of December 1948. The attending physician line carried Caleb's full name and modern medical license number. Caleb called his mother. Eleanor was alive and resting at home, but she became frightened when he mentioned Mercy Hollow. She admitted that an old woman had telephoned her every December since childhood. The caller always asked whether Eleanor remembered the night she was born and whether Dr. Monroe had returned safely. Eleanor had assumed the calls came from someone confused or mentally ill. That evening, however, an unfamiliar black automobile had been parked across from her house for nearly an hour. Its design appeared to be from the 1940s. County archives showed that Mercy Hollow had existed in the mountains until the winter of 1948. A landslide destroyed the only access road during a severe snowstorm, isolating 23 families. Official reports claimed that residents abandoned the community the following spring, yet a handwritten medical ledger told a different story. Dr. Samuel Reed had entered the hollow on December 9 to assist a woman during childbirth and never returned. Searchers found his empty vehicle beside the collapsed road, but neither the doctor nor his medical bag was recovered. One damaged newspaper clipping described Margaret Monroe as a young widow who had moved to Mercy Hollow while pregnant. She was found dead inside her home after rescuers reached the community several days later. The report stated that her infant daughter had also died, although no bodies appeared in the county burial register. Despite that record, Eleanor's adoption certificate claimed she had been discovered alive near the Ash Ridge Clinic on the morning of December 10th. She had been wrapped in a blanket carrying Margaret Monroe's initials. At 11:43, the clinic telephone rang again. This time, Caleb heard a newborn crying behind the midwife's voice, although the baby had supposedly not yet been delivered. Ruth warned that Dr. Reed had tried to change the birth once before and had become trapped inside the night. She said the hollow would remain accessible until sunrise, but anyone who entered had to leave before the church bell rang for the third time. If the physician stayed longer, the medical record would replace him with the doctor who had originally disappeared. Caleb and Laura drove toward Bell Creek Road carrying the old medical bag. Snow began falling heavily as they passed the Forest Service gate. Their GPS screens went blank, and the modern pavement narrowed into an unmarked dirt road. Wooden telephone poles appeared along the shoulder, their wires humming beneath layers of ice. Although they had traveled less than 2 miles, the dashboard clock moved backward from 11:58 to 11:21. At the bottom of the mountain, lights glowed inside a group of houses absent from every modern map. Mercy Hollow looked untouched by more than 70 years. Horses stood beside barns, smoke rose from stone chimneys, and old cars sat beneath the snow. Residents watched from their porches, but did not react to Caleb's modern vehicle. Every clock visible through the windows showed a different time between midnight and dawn. Near the center of town stood a small church with a bell already moving inside its tower, although no sound came from it. Ruth Bell waited outside the Monroe house wearing a dark wool coat. Historical photographs identified her as the Mercy Hollow midwife who had died in 1966. She had not aged beyond her appearance in 1948. Inside, Margaret lay unconscious while blood soaked the blankets beneath her. Dr. Samuel Reed stood beside the bed, holding an empty medicine bottle. He looked exactly as he appeared in the archive photograph, but his hands had become transparent as though he were slowly disappearing from the room. Reed explained that he had delivered the child successfully in 1948, but Margaret died minutes later. While carrying the baby toward the clinic, he encountered a second road hidden inside the snow. It returned him to the house several hours before the birth. Every attempt to leave caused the night to begin again. He eventually discovered that Eleanor survived only because someone from her future had signed the birth certificate. Until Caleb completed the delivery, the child existed without a true beginning, forcing Mercy Hollow to repeat the same night. The church bell rang for the first time. Caleb examined Margaret and realized the birth could not continue naturally. Using the instruments from Reed's bag, he performed an emergency procedure while Laura assisted Ruth. As the child was delivered, every lamp inside the hollow became brighter. The baby breathed once, then fell silent. Caleb administered medication from a sealed bottle carrying an expiration date from 2022. Moments later, the newborn began crying. A small birthmark beneath her left shoulder matched one Caleb had seen on his mother throughout his life. The second bell rang. The walls of the house became transparent, revealing different versions of the same room layered together. In one, Margaret and the infant were dead. In another, Reed carried the child into the snow. In a third, an adult Eleanor stood beside Caleb, watching her own birth. Ruth warned that the correct version would become permanent only when the attending doctor signed the certificate and removed the infant from Mercy Hollow. Caleb signed his name. Reed's body immediately became solid, while Caleb's hands began fading. The county record had accepted Caleb as the physician present in 1948 and was removing him from the life in which he had been born decades later. Family photographs on Laura's phone changed one by one. Caleb disappeared from his medical school graduation, his clinic opening, and every image taken with Eleanor. Even Laura struggled to remember why she had entered the hollow with him. Reed took the infant and moved toward the door, but Caleb stopped him. The original ledger stated that Reed vanished because he carried Eleanor out. Caleb understood that the record required an attending physician to remain behind, but it did not specify which one. If Reed left with the baby, Caleb would become the doctor trapped inside the repeating night. If Caleb left, history would continue exactly as it had, and Reed would disappear for more than 70 years. Before either man could decide, Margaret regained consciousness. She placed one hand on the birth certificate and wrote Ruth Bell's name beneath the witness line. As the midwife touched the paper, the medical record changed. It now listed Margaret as surviving the delivery and Ruth as the person responsible for transporting the child. The hollow shook violently because its official history no longer matched the deaths recorded outside. The third bell began moving. Ruth wrapped Eleanor in the blanket and gave her to Caleb. She had already died according to records from 1966, so the changing certificate could not erase a future life she no longer possessed. Ruth pushed Caleb, Laura, Reed, Margaret, and the child outside as every telephone in Mercy Hollow started ringing. The residents stepped from their homes and walked toward the church, carrying documents that showed different versions of their deaths. Caleb drove toward the mountain with the infant in Laura's arms. Behind them, Mercy Hollow disappeared beneath a wall of snow. The road shortened with every turn until their vehicle reached the modern highway seconds before sunrise. When they looked into the back seat, the newborn was gone. Only the blanket and completed birth certificate remained. Eleanor was found asleep inside Caleb's clinic, wrapped in the same blanket she had carried since infancy. To her, only a few minutes had passed. County records changed before noon. Margaret Monroe was now listed as surviving childbirth and living until 1989. Dr. Reed returned safely from Mercy Hollow and operated the Ash Ridge Clinic until retirement. No document mentioned Ruth Bell delivering the child, although her name remained freshly written on the original certificate. Caleb kept his memories, but the black medical bag vanished from the clinic floor. 1 year later, it appeared outside his mother's home during the first December snow. Inside was another completed birth certificate dated the following morning. The mother belonged to a family living deep in the mountains, and the attending physician was Caleb Monroe. The child's name was unfamiliar, but Laura discovered that the same person was currently a 70-year-old judge living in another Appalachian county. Rural doctors around Ash Ridge now follow an unofficial rule whenever a house call arrives from a disconnected line. They ask the caller for the patient's birth date before leaving the clinic. If the birth happened decades earlier, they never take an old medical bag or follow a road that appears only during snow, because some children are not calling for a doctor to save their lives. They are calling for someone from the future to enter the past and complete the birth that allowed them to exist. In this new story, northern Minnesota has thousands of frozen lakes, each carrying stories passed from one generation to the next. Most speak of fishermen who vanished during blizzards or travelers who underestimated the brutal winter. But among local search and rescue volunteers, one legend has endured for more than 60 years. It tells of a small wooden cabin that appears on the surface of Frost Hollow Lake after the season's first major snowstorm. By dawn, the cabin is always gone. Those who claim to have stepped inside rarely tell the same story twice, and a few never return at all. Despite decades of investigations, no photograph has ever proven the cabin exists, yet every winter, new reports continue to arrive from people who have never met each other. In January 1996, wildlife photographer Nathan Cole traveled north, hoping to capture wolves moving across frozen lakes after fresh snowfall. He had spent years documenting remote wilderness and was known for refusing to exaggerate his work. Friends trusted his observations because Nathan never confused legends with facts. Every unusual photograph he published could be supported by weather reports, maps, and careful notes. When he rented a small cabin near Frost Hollow Lake, he laughed after hearing locals warn him about another cabin that supposedly appeared on the ice. To Nathan, the story sounded like another piece of winter folklore created to entertain visitors during long nights. 3 days into his trip, a powerful snowstorm swept across the region. Visibility dropped to only a few yards, temperatures fell below zero, and every road leading to the lake was closed. Shortly before sunset, Nathan climbed a nearby ridge, hoping to photograph the storm rolling across the frozen water. Through blowing snow, he noticed something impossible. Near the center of the lake stood a single cabin with smoke rising gently from its chimney. No tracks led toward it, no snowmobiles were parked nearby. According to every local map, there had never been a structure anywhere on the lake. Assuming another photographer had built a temporary shelter, Nathan aimed his telephoto lens toward the cabin. The windows glowed with warm yellow light, but every photograph came back strangely blurred, as though the building existed slightly out of focus while everything around it remained perfectly sharp. Even after changing lenses and camera settings, the result never improved. Through binoculars, however, the cabin appeared perfectly clear. A single rocking chair rested on the porch, and thin trails of smoke continued drifting into the darkening sky. Curiosity outweighed caution. Nathan marked the cabin's position with his compass and began crossing the frozen lake before darkness settled completely. The snow beneath his boots remained untouched, confirming no one had reached the cabin before him. Halfway across, he stopped to look back toward shore. His own footprints stretched behind him in a straight line. When he turned forward again, the cabin seemed much closer than it should have been, although he had not taken another step. The distance separating him from the porch had somehow shortened without explanation. The cabin looked old, but remarkably well maintained. Thick pine logs formed the walls, the windows remained clean, and fresh firewood rested beside the entrance despite the heavy snowfall. What unsettled Nathan most was the porch itself. Every surrounding surface carried several inches of fresh snow, yet the wooden steps remained perfectly dry. The warmth from the chimney should not have reached that far, but not a single snowflake had settled there. It looked as though someone had swept the porch only moments earlier. Inside, the air smelled of burning cedar and old coffee. A cast-iron stove heated the room while several shelves held books, lanterns, and neatly folded blankets. Nothing suggested abandonment. Yet, there were no family photographs, no clothing, and no personal belongings identifying the owner. A guest book rested on a small table beside the door. Curious, Nathan opened it, expecting signatures from hunters or fishermen. Instead, every page contained only names and dates. Many entries belonged to people officially listed as missing across northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario. Some names stretched back nearly 50 years. The final blank line waited beneath them. Nathan refused to write his name. Instead, he photographed every page before exploring the rest of the cabin. One bedroom contained a freshly made bed, another held only an antique clock mounted on the wall. The hands pointed to 6:42 and refused to move despite the loud ticking filling the room. As Nathan reached for the clock, someone knocked 3 times on the front door. The sound was calm, deliberate, and impossible. He had crossed the untouched lake alone. No footprints existed outside except his own. The knocking came again. Nathan slowly opened the door. The frozen lake stretched silently beneath the moonlight. No one stood outside. His footprints remained exactly where he had left them, ending at the porch steps. Then he noticed something impossible. A second line of footprints had appeared beside his own, leading away from the cabin toward the opposite shore. Whoever made them had left the porch, but no matching tracks approached it. It was as though someone had walked out of the cabin without ever entering. Nathan followed the mysterious trail for nearly 200 yards before it stopped beside a dark crack in the ice. Looking through the narrow opening, he expected to see freezing water. Instead, a beam of flashlight light slowly moved beneath the ice far below his feet, followed by the faint silhouette of someone walking across the lake's bottom. The figure paused directly beneath him before continuing into darkness until both the light and the footsteps disappeared completely. When Nathan looked back toward the cabin, the chimney smoke had stopped. Every window had gone dark. He hurried back across the lake. The front door now stood wide open, although he clearly remembered closing it behind him. Inside, the fire had died completely, leaving the stove cold enough to touch. Frost covered the walls, and the guest book had vanished from the table. Only one object remained where it had been before. The antique clock still pointed to 6:42. This time, however, a fresh line had appeared beneath the missing names. It simply read, "One more sunrise." Nathan spent the rest of the night awake, convinced daylight would finally reveal an ordinary explanation. Instead, he was awakened before dawn by absolute silence. The wind had stopped. The trees no longer moved. Even the groaning sounds normally heard beneath thick lake ice had disappeared. As the first light reached the horizon, the cabin began fading exactly as morning fog disappears beneath sunlight. The walls grew transparent, the chimney dissolved. Within seconds, nothing remained except an endless sheet of untouched snow covering the frozen lake. Nathan stood alone in the exact place where the cabin had been, surrounded by open ice in every direction. Search and rescue volunteers reached Nathan later that morning after his vehicle was reported abandoned near the trailhead. They found him standing nearly 2 miles from shore, holding his camera against his chest. The photographs showed the frozen lake, the surrounding forest, and Nathan's own footprints. Every image containing the cabin had disappeared from the memory card without affecting any of the others. The only unusual photograph showed the surface of the lake moments before sunrise. Beneath the clear ice stood dozens of shadowy figures looking upward, each separated by several yards, as though waiting patiently beneath the frozen water. Nathan never returned to Frost Hollow Lake. He published thousands of wildlife photographs during the following 20 years, but never spoke publicly about what happened that winter. Shortly before his death, he donated his journals to a local historical society. Investigators discovered one page sealed inside an envelope marked, "Do not open during winter." Inside was a hand-drawn map showing the exact location of the mysterious cabin. At the bottom, Nathan had written a single sentence. He claimed the cabin did not appear because people found it. It appeared because, every winter, it quietly chose someone to visit instead. Today, the lake remains popular with ice fishermen and snowmobile riders. Rangers dismiss stories about the cabin as local folklore, yet they continue receiving occasional reports from visitors describing smoke rising from the center of the frozen lake during severe snowstorms. Every witness agrees on one detail. The cabin always disappears with the first light of dawn, leaving behind nothing except untouched snow and a single line of footprints leading away from a porch that no longer exists. Search teams have followed those footprints many times. Every trail ends in the middle of the frozen lake where no cabin has ever been found. In this new story, anechoic chambers are designed to absorb every reflection of sound. Inside one, footsteps vanish beneath the body, breathing feels unnaturally loud, and a person may hear the movement of blood through their own ears. But in October 2022, an acoustic engineer entered a chamber at a laboratory abandoned for 36 years and heard a woman whispering from behind 12 feet of concrete. The voice belonged to his wife, missing since 2011. She warned that the room had begun learning their daughter's voice and would become completely silent when it took her. Ethan Ward had spent 22 years measuring noise in hospitals, factories, theaters, and aircraft cabins. His wife, Mara, had worked as an investigative radio producer until she vanished while researching the closed Halcyon Communications Laboratory outside Dayton, Ohio. Her car remained in the employee lot, Her recorder was found beside a sealed testing chamber, and security footage showed her entering the building alone, but never leaving. Their daughter, Claire, was now 24 and hosted a local podcast using the same calm voice people once recognized in Mara. The laboratory's new owner hired Ethan before converting the property into offices. Most rooms contained ordinary recording booths and rusted equipment, but Chamber 6 had been hidden behind a concrete wall added in 1986. Blueprints described it as a zero-reflection room measuring 30 feet by 30 feet. When workers opened the wall, they found a steel door covered with acoustic foam and an analog meter still showing a signal despite the building having no electricity. The needle moved each time Ethan spoke his name. County investigator Naomi Reyes joined him. Inside, thousands of gray wedges trapped every sound before it could return as an echo. Ethan clapped once and heard nothing. Then, a second clap sounded from deep inside the wall, followed by a woman breathing. Mara's voice said he had 6 hours before the room finished copying Claire and warned him not to answer if he heard himself speaking from behind the phone. Floor sensors produced a waveform matching Mara's archived broadcasts, while another pattern repeated Claire's name, birth date, and address with increasing accuracy. At Claire's apartment, every recording she had made during the previous year began changing. Her podcast introductions vanished, while music and guest voices remained. Video showed her mouth moving, but no sound came from it. During a call with Ethan, complete words dropped from the connection until only her breathing remained. A message appeared on her studio monitor stating that vocal reference C12 would be transferred to Chamber 6 at 3:20 the following morning. Naomi found files for Project Hush, a military-funded experiment begun in 1973. Engineers recorded a person's voice, inverted the sound wave, and played the opposite pattern through hidden speakers, so both waves canceled each other. Director Samuel Voss believed the method could do more than silent secure rooms. 9 employees who had reported a deadly solvent leak were brought into Chamber 6 to give statements. By morning, their tapes were silent, coworkers could no longer remember their voices, and all 9 had vanished from the locked chamber. Their families remembered their faces, but became unable to say their names aloud. Mara discovered Project Hush in 2011 and entered the chamber with a recorder, reading all 9 names into the microphone. Ethan had been repairing the laboratory's monitoring equipment that night and saw a dangerous feedback warning. Believing Mara was outside, he remotely activated the emergency sound canceling system. She vanished before he reached the room. Ethan later found her final interview on a backup drive, but it exposed a confidential source and accused surviving Halcyon executives of crimes. Afraid of what the company might do to Claire, he erased it and told police the system had activated automatically. At 12:44 a.m., Claire arrived at the laboratory despite officers guarding her apartment. Nobody outside Chamber 6 could hear anything she said, and her reflection in the observation window continued speaking after she closed her mouth. The meter labeled C12 climbed toward 100% as a fresh foam wedge pushed outward from the chamber wall, shaped like the inside of a human mouth. Ethan entered carrying a safety line and Mara's old recorder. When the door closed, the gray wedges expanded into a corridor far longer than the building. Openings along the corridor revealed silent rooms from different decades. Missing people stood inside them, repeating statements they had given before, vanishing, but no sound crossed the thresholds. Each person was connected to a black reel turning behind the phone. Mara waited at the far end, unchanged since 2011, and believed less than 2 weeks had passed. She explained that Chamber 6 trapped anyone whose last truthful words existed only in canceled form. Once every outside copy disappeared, the room became the sole place still carrying that voice and absorbed the person who had spoken it. Mara had prevented Claire's transfer by repeating her daughter's name, but each repetition allowed the system to imitate Claire more precisely. Once the copy became perfect, the chamber could cancel Claire anywhere. She would first disappear from recordings, then from conversations, and finally from the memories of people who knew her through speech. In the original control room, 9 black reels turned beside Mara's reel, while an empty spindle labeled C12 waited below them. Samuel Voss sat at the console, unchanged from archive photographs. He had entered in 1986 to keep the system operating and had spent decades searching for stronger voices to replace the failing tapes. Voss offered to release Mara if Ethan allowed Claire's reel to finish. Mara's years as a broadcaster had kept the 9 witnesses stable, but her voice was weakening, while Claire's modern recordings existed on thousands of devices. Ethan refused and removed 1 black reel. The volunteer connected to it immediately began fading because no uncanceled copy of his statement existed outside. Naomi located the original written transcripts while Claire opened a live broadcast from the laboratory, and Ethan began reading each witness's full name and testimony through Mara's recorder. Thousands of phones and computers received the words at once. With every statement preserved outside Chamber 6, 1 reel stopped and 1 missing witness stepped through an opening into the modern laboratory. The final reel belonged to Mara, but Ethan no longer possessed her deleted interview. Mara repeated the investigation from inside the corridor, while Claire watched the silent movement of her lips through the glass, typed every word, attached the source documents, and published them under both their names. The chamber rejected text because Mara's truthful statement had originally been spoken. Someone outside had to give it a living voice. Claire began reading her mother's statement aloud, even though nobody could hear her. The waveform still appeared on Ethan's instruments. He routed it through the old emergency speaker network and reversed the polarity Voss had used in 1973. Instead of canceling Claire, the system canceled the inverted copies stored behind the walls. Her voice returned through every speaker at once, carrying Mara's testimony across the property and into the live broadcast. Mara's reel split down the center, and the chamber shook as decades of absorbed voices returned in one violent wave. Ethan pulled Mara toward the steel door, while Naomi dragged Claire away from the observation glass. Voss tried to start the C12 spindle manually, but the 9 witnesses emerged from the foam and repeated his name until his body flattened into a black waveform across the console. The corridor collapsed, and Chamber 6 cracked from floor to ceiling. Ethan, Mara, Claire, and the missing witnesses were found outside at 3:20. None of those taken had aged, and Mara returned 11 years younger than Ethan. Ethan publicly admitted activating the system and erasing Mara's recording. Halcyon's surviving records led investigators to the poisoned workers and the officials who concealed the leak. Chamber 6 was demolished under federal supervision, and every foam wedge was burned. 6 months later, a recording studio in another state reported that one new acoustic panel absorbed more sound than laboratory measurements could explain. During a singer's session, the panel whispered the lyrics several seconds before she performed them. By morning, her voice had vanished from every recording she had ever made. Acoustic engineers now follow an unofficial rule whenever a silent room produces a voice from behind its walls. They do not answer, repeat the words, or activate noise cancellation until the speaker has been identified. If a recording loses one person while every other sound remains, the original voice is copied and stored in several places before anyone enters the chamber, because some rooms do not become quiet by absorbing echoes. They become quiet by taking the person who made the sound and leaving only the opposite voice behind.